A twist in the routine. The first day of school carried the usual mix of excitement and dread for Anthony Jacobs. At 15 years old, he had settled into the rhythm of high school, a mix of academics, basketball practice, and helping his adoptive parents at their local bakery. Anthony had always been a quiet kid, preferring the smell of warm bread and vanilla icing to the chaos of a crowded cafeteria. But this year felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of room 302, casting golden streaks across the rows of desks. Mrs. Bell, their English teacher, was already at her desk, shuffling papers. The buzz of chatter filled the room as students exchanged summer stories. Anthony sat in his usual spot near the middle, flipping through a paperback novel he'd started the night before. "All right, class," Mrs. Bell called out, her voice commanding but kind. "Before we dive into the syllabus, we have a new student joining us this year. Please give a warm welcome to Ethan Carter." Anthony glanced up lazily, his eyes landing on a boy standing at the front of the room. For a moment, he froze. The new kid, Ethan, looked eerily familiar. Same height, same build, and even the same intense hazel eyes that Anthony saw in the mirror every morning. The only differences were that Ethan's hair was slightly darker, and he carried himself with an easy confidence that Anthony could only envy. The class murmured as Ethan introduced himself. He had just moved to town with his adoptive parents, his dad having taken a job at the local hospital. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, but his eyes flicked nervously around the room, as if he could feel the stares that lingered too long. Anthony wasn't the only one who noticed. "Whoa, dude, you guys look like twins." Mike, Anthony's best friend, whispered loudly from behind him. Several other students nodded in agreement, their gazes bouncing back and forth between Anthony and Ethan like spectators at a tennis match. Anthony's cheeks burned under the scrutiny. He ducked his head, pretending to focus on his book, but he couldn't help sneaking glances at Ethan. The resemblance was uncanny, but it was more than just looks. There was something in the way Ethan smiled at a joke Mrs. Bell made, or the way he fidgeted with the strap of his backpack. It was like watching a mirror version of himself, one who lived a slightly different life. Ethan ended up sitting 2 rows away, and Anthony felt the weight of his presence throughout the class. When the bell rang, Anthony gathered his things slowly, hoping to avoid the rush of students filing out. But as he stepped into the hallway, Ethan was there, leaning casually against the lockers. "You're Anthony, right?" Ethan said, his voice friendly, but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "Yeah," Anthony replied cautiously. "And you're Ethan." Ethan grinned. "Funny how people think we look alike." Anthony shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant. "Guess so." But it wasn't just the resemblance that lingered in Anthony's mind. There was an odd familiarity, like meeting someone you'd known in a dream but couldn't quite place in reality. The first connection. By lunchtime, the whispers about the twins had spread through most of the school. When Anthony entered the cafeteria, his friends immediately waved him over to their usual table. But before he could sit, he spotted Ethan standing near the entrance, looking unsure of where to go. "Hey, Ethan," Anthony called, surprising himself with the invitation. "Want to sit with us?" Ethan's face lit up with relief, and he made his way over. As he slid into the seat beside Anthony, the group erupted in chatter. "Man, this is nuts," Mike said, shaking his head. "You guys are like copy-paste versions of each other." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, it's pretty wild. Never had someone look this much like me before." As the lunch period went on, the conversation turned to hobbies and summer vacations. Anthony learned that Ethan loved basketball, though he hadn't joined any teams since moving. They shared a love for reading, though Ethan leaned toward science fiction, while Anthony preferred historical fiction. By the time lunch ended, they had discovered a dozen little things they had in common, from their mutual hatred of olives to their knack for doodling geometric patterns on their notebooks. But the most unsettling moment came when Mike, ever the Joker, made a terrible pun about books. Anthony and Ethan groaned in perfect unison, then froze. Their reactions, down to the way they rubbed their temples afterward, were identical. The table erupted in laughter, but Anthony couldn't shake the odd feeling that had been growing all day. An unsettling discovery. The next day, the resemblance continued to be the talk of the school. Anthony tried to ignore the whispers and curious stares, but he couldn't help noticing how naturally he and Ethan got along. They partnered for a group project in history class, deciding to meet at Anthony's house that afternoon. When Ethan arrived, Anthony introduced him to his parents, Sarah and Greg Jacobs. Sarah was warm and welcoming, offering Ethan cookies and lemonade, while Greg nodded approvingly from his spot behind the counter of the bakery. But Anthony noticed a strange flicker in his mother's expression when she looked at Ethan, something between confusion and recognition. They worked on their project in Anthony's room, brainstorming ideas for their presentation. Conversation flowed easily, and Anthony found himself enjoying Ethan's company more than he expected. It was like they had known each other forever, even though they'd only met a day ago. "Hey," Ethan said suddenly, glancing at a framed photo on Anthony's desk. It was a picture of Anthony as a baby, cradled in his mother's arms. "You were a cute kid." Anthony smirked. "Thanks, I guess. My mom loves that picture." Ethan frowned, his gaze lingering on the photo. "You know, you kind of look like me when I was a baby. At least from what I've seen in old pictures." Anthony laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, I guess babies all look kind of the same." But the comment stuck with him. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he pulled out his phone and searched for photos of himself and Ethan that Sarah had taken during their project session. Side by side, the similarities were undeniable. The thought crept into his mind uninvited. Could we actually be related? A bond beyond the surface. The cafeteria was a cacophony of clinking trays and overlapping voices as students navigated the maze of tables. Anthony Jacobs held his lunch tray and scanned the room, his usual table already half filled with his friends. But his eyes landed on Ethan Carter, standing awkwardly near the entrance, his tray untouched, his gaze darting around the crowded room like a deer unsure of where to go. Anthony hesitated for only a moment. There was something about Ethan that made him want to help. Maybe it was the familiar unease he saw in his expression, or maybe it was that strange pull, like a magnet drawing him closer to someone he was certain he'd never met. "Ethan," Anthony called out, raising a hand. "Over here." Ethan's head turned toward him, and a flicker of relief washed over his face. With a quick nod, he navigated his way through the rows of tables, sliding into an empty seat next to Anthony. "Thanks, man," Ethan said, setting down his tray. "I wasn't sure where to sit. First days are the worst." "No problem," Anthony replied, feeling an odd sense of comfort in Ethan's presence. "These guys won't bite. Most of the time." The table erupted in laughter as introductions were made. Ethan quickly became the focus of the conversation, his easygoing nature and quick wit blending seamlessly with the group. Mike, ever the clown, couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room. "So, Ethan," Mike said, leaning across the table with a mischievous grin, "what's it like sitting next to your clone?" Ethan smirked, glancing at Anthony. "Weird, but I guess it's better than sitting alone." Anthony chuckled, but the comment lingered in his mind. There was no denying it anymore. The resemblance between them wasn't just striking, it was unsettling. They weren't just similar, they were practically identical. As the lunch period wore on, Anthony and Ethan found themselves the center of attention. Mike egged them on, testing their synchronicity with ridiculous challenges. "All right," Mike said, clapping his hands together. "Say your favorite color on 3. 1, 2, 3. "Blue," they said in unison, their voices overlapping perfectly. The table erupted in laughter, but Sarah, the group's most observant member, narrowed her eyes. "Okay, that was freaky. Let's try something harder. Favorite pizza topping?" Pepperoni, they answered, again in perfect unison. The laughter subsided, replaced by a mixture of awe and discomfort. Anthony glanced at Ethan, who looked just as unsettled as he felt. "You guys are seriously starting to creep me out," Sarah said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Are you sure you're not, like, related or something?" Ethan shrugged, his usual confidence faltering. "Not that I know of. I mean, I'm adopted, but I've never heard anything about a twin." Anthony's heart skipped a beat. "You're adopted?" "Yeah," Ethan said casually, though his eyes flickered with something deeper. "What about you?" Anthony hesitated. "I am too." The table fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. For a moment, Anthony couldn't breathe. It was too much of a coincidence, too many similarities to ignore. But before he could dwell on it, the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of the period. As they gathered their trays, Ethan caught Anthony's arm. "Hey, can we talk after school? Just the two of us." Anthony nodded, his mind racing with questions. "Yeah, sure." The walk home. After school, they met outside the building, their steps falling into an easy rhythm as they walked toward the park. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, leaves crunching underfoot as they made their way to a secluded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. "I didn't mean to make things weird," Ethan began, his voice softer than usual. "But doesn't it feel like there's something going on here?" Anthony nodded slowly. "Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it's weird. Too many coincidences." Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling through a folder of photos. "These are the only baby pictures I have. My adoptive parents said they didn't get much from the agency when they adopted me." Anthony leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat as he studied the photos. Ethan, as a toddler, his wide hazel eyes and mop of dark curls identical to Anthony's own baby pictures. "I have the same blanket," Anthony said, pointing to a photo of Ethan wrapped in a faded blue quilt with a sunflower pattern. "My mom kept it in my room until I was 10. Ethan's eyes widened. "That's the blanket I came with when they adopted me. They said it was the only thing my birth parents left behind." The words hit Anthony like a freight train. He leaned back, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Had they been separated at birth? "Do you know anything about your birth parents?" Ethan asked, his voice hesitant. Anthony shook his head. "Not really. My parents said the adoption agency didn't give them much info, just that I was born in the city and given up as a baby." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Same. My parents always said I had a brother, but they thought he didn't survive. They never talked about it much, though." Anthony felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, fear, and a deep sense of longing. "Do you think we should, I don't know, look into it?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I mean, if there's even a chance, we have to, right?" First clue. The next day, they decided to start their investigation. During lunch, they sat in the library, poring over their adoption paperwork. Both sets of parents had kept the original documents in a box of keepsakes, and while the files didn't contain much, there were enough similarities to raise more questions. Ethan's paperwork listed his birth date as September 15th, 2008, the same as Anthony's. Both adoptions had been handled by the same agency, though they had been finalized months apart. "This has to mean something," Anthony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are the odds?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, man. But we can't stop here. We need to ask our parents." The thought filled Anthony with dread. His adoptive parents had always been loving and supportive, but the idea of confronting them with this, it felt like opening a wound that had never fully healed. "Yeah," Anthony said finally. "We'll talk to them. Together." That evening, Anthony and Ethan sat in the Jacobs' living room, their adoption papers spread across the coffee table. Sarah and Greg Jacobs sat across from them, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. "What's this all about?" Greg asked, his brow furrowed. Anthony took a deep breath. We think Ethan and I might be related. Like, really related. Sarah's eyes widened. What? How? How is that possible? Anthony explained everything. Their resemblance, their shared birthday, the identical adoption agency. As he spoke, Sarah's expression shifted from shock to something deeper, something more painful. When he finished, the room fell silent. Sarah exchanged a look with Greg, her hands trembling. There's something we need to tell you, she said finally, her voice breaking. Something we should have told you a long time ago. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest as he braced himself for the truth. The puzzle pieces. Anthony and Ethan sat on the edge of their seats, their adoptive parents' silence stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah Jacobs, usually composed, struggled to find her words, her hands clutching her lap. Anthony, she began, her voice trembling. There's something I never thought we'd need to discuss, but it seems we don't have a choice anymore. Anthony's stomach nodded. What is it? Greg Jacobs leaned forward, his hands clasped together tightly. When we adopted you, the agency mentioned, there might have been another child. A twin. A twin. Anthony's voice cracked, the word hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah nodded, her face pale. They told us your birth mother gave birth to 2 boys, but they said the other baby didn't survive. That's all they told us. We never questioned it because, well, it was too painful to think about. Anthony felt the room spinning around him. His mind latched onto the image of Ethan sitting beside him. The resemblance, the shared birthday, the identical mannerisms. It all made sense now. Ethan, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke. My parents said something similar. They always believed I had a brother, but they never got any confirmation. They thought the adoption agency might have lied or been misinformed. The Jacobs' living room grew heavy with the weight of realization. Anthony and Ethan exchanged a look, their shared understanding now undeniable. A search for truth. The next morning, the boys decided to dig deeper into their adoption records. They pooled their files together, piecing through every document, every note, every scrap of information. It was slow, painstaking work, but their determination pushed them forward. I don't get it, Ethan muttered, flipping through his paperwork. If we were twins, why would they separate us? That doesn't make any sense. Anthony frowned, tracing his finger over the name of the adoption agency, Sunrise Family Services. Maybe it wasn't intentional, or maybe they didn't want us to know. Ethan looked up sharply. You think they hid it on purpose? Anthony hesitated, then nodded. It's possible. Adopting out twins separately could have been easier for them. Less complicated. But we won't know for sure unless we talk to someone who worked there. Good luck with that, Ethan said with a sigh. This agency shut down years ago. My parents tried to get more info when I was little, but they hit a dead end. Anthony leaned back in frustration, running a hand through his hair. There has to be something we're missing. Some bleed. After hours of combing through the documents, Ethan spotted something unusual. A handwritten note scrawled in the margins of his intake form. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. Transfer approved to alternate facility. Case #1129. Transfer, Anthony said, leaning over Ethan's shoulder. What does that mean? I don't know, Ethan replied, his brow furrowed. But alternate facility sounds like they moved me somewhere else before I was adopted. The boys shared a look, their determination renewed. They decided to bring this new discovery to Ethan's adoptive parents. An emotional conversation. That evening, Anthony accompanied Ethan to the Carter's home. Ethan's adoptive mother, Helen, greeted them warmly, her face lighting up at the sight of her son. But when they explained their theory, that they were long-lost twins, her expression shifted to one of shock. You really think you're brothers? Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. We don't just think, Mom. We're almost sure. Everything matches. Our birthdays, the adoption agency, even this note about a transfer. He handed her the document, and she studied it intently. Her hands trembled as she held the paper, tears welling in her eyes. "I always knew there was something more to your story," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But every time your father and I tried to dig deeper, we hit walls." Sunrise Family Services was notorious for being secretive. Anthony leaned forward. "Do you remember anything specific? Anything that might help us?" Helen nodded slowly. "There was one time, right after we brought Ethan home, when a social worker mentioned something about a sibling. But when I asked for details, they shut me down. They said the sibling had been placed and that we weren't allowed to know more." Ethan clenched his fists. "So they knew. They knew I had a brother, and they didn't tell us." Helen's tears spilled over as she reached for Ethan's hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. If I'd known, I would have done everything to find him." Ethan squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "I know, Mom. It's not your fault." Anthony felt a pang of sympathy for Helen, but his frustration with the adoption agency only grew. "We need to find someone who worked there, someone who can tell us the truth." Finding a lead. The next day, armed with their combined documents, Anthony and Ethan visited the local library to search for any information on Sunrise Family Services. Hours of digging through old newspapers and online archives finally yielded a breakthrough. A list of former employees from the agency, published in a decades-old article about its closure. One name stood out: Margaret Hensley, a retired caseworker who had been involved in dozens of adoption placements during her time at the agency. According to the article, she now lived in a nearby suburb. "This is it," Anthony said, pointing to the screen. "She might be the key to everything." Ethan grinned. "Let's go talk to her." A meeting that changes everything. 2 days later, the boys found themselves standing on the front porch of a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Ethan rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, an elderly woman with kind eyes opened the door. "Margaret Hensley?" Anthony asked. She nodded, her gaze shifting between the two boys. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Anthony hesitated, then took a deep breath. "We think you handled our adoption cases. We were both adopted through Sunrise Family Services, and we believe we're brothers." Margaret's eyes widened as she took in their striking resemblance. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to let them enter. They sat in her cozy living room, explaining everything they'd discovered. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more somber with each word. When they finished, she sighed heavily. "I remember your case. Both of you." Anthony's heart raced. "You do?" Margaret nodded. "You were twins, born prematurely to a young mother who couldn't care for you. She wanted you to stay together, but the agency decided to separate you because it was easier to place single children with families." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They separated us on purpose." Margaret's eyes filled with regret. "I fought against it, but I didn't have the authority to change the decision. I'm so sorry." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. For the first time, Anthony and Ethan knew the truth about their past, a truth that was as heartbreaking as it was liberating. Anthony glanced at Ethan, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Well, we're together now. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, a small smile breaking through the storm. "Yeah, we found each other." Rebuilding the past. The silence in Margaret Hensley's living room was thick with emotion. Anthony and Ethan sat side by side, their hands resting on their knees, absorbing the truth they had uncovered. For the first time in their lives, the two boys knew who they truly were. It wasn't just a feeling or a wild theory anymore. They were brothers, long-lost twins, separated by decisions neither of them had any say in. "I still can't believe it," Ethan said softly, staring down at his hands. "All this time, I thought I was alone." Anthony placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his own voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "You're not alone anymore." Margaret, sitting across from them, clasped her hands tightly. Her face was a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "I want you both to know," she began, her voice trembling, "that I deeply regret what happened. Separating siblings was a common practice back then, especially for twins. The agency believed it would be easier to place you in good homes that way." "Easier for them, maybe," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "But it wasn't right." Margaret nodded, her expression heavy with regret. "No, it wasn't, and I should have fought harder to keep you together. But there's one more thing you should know." Anthony and Ethan both leaned forward, their hearts pounding. "What is it?" Anthony asked. Margaret hesitated before continuing. "Your biological mother. She didn't want to give you up. She was young, just 18, and under a lot of pressure from her family. But she made me promise that if she couldn't keep you, you would at least know about each other someday." Anthony felt a lump rise in his throat. "She made you promise?" "Yes," Margaret said, tears glistening in her eyes. "And I failed her. I wasn't able to keep that promise when the agency closed and all the records were sealed. But now I can help you reconnect with her." The room went still. "She's still alive," Ethan whispered. Margaret nodded. "Last I heard, she was living in the city. I kept her contact information even after the agency closed. Just in case. If you're ready, I can help you find her." Preparing for the meeting. The ride back to Anthony's house was quiet. Both boys were lost in thought, the weight of what they had learned pressing down on them. Their biological mother, the woman who had brought them into the world and fought to keep them together, was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. At home, Anthony and Ethan shared the news with their adoptive parents. The Jacobs and the Carters sat together in the living room, their faces a mixture of shock and understanding. "She's alive?" Sarah Jacobs asked, her voice breaking. "And she wanted to keep them together." Ethan nodded. "Margaret said she tried, but her family forced her to give us up." Greg Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "What do you boys want to do? This is a big step." Anthony glanced at Ethan, then back at his parents. "We want to meet her. We need to." Helen Carter placed a hand over her heart, her eyes glistening with tears. "We'll support you, no matter what. Both of you." In the days that followed, Margaret worked to track down their biological mother, whose name was Claire Donnelly. She lived just a few hours away, working as a teacher in a small town. Margaret reached out to her first, explaining the situation. Claire's response was immediate. She wanted to see her sons as soon as possible. The first reunion. The day of the meeting arrived faster than either Anthony or Ethan expected. They drove to the small town with their adoptive parents, their emotions swinging wildly between excitement and fear. What would she be like? Would she want a relationship with them? And most importantly, would this meeting bring closure or open new wounds? They arrived at a quaint little cafe, its windows adorned with cheerful flower boxes. Margaret was already there, sitting at a corner table with a woman who looked both nervous and hopeful. As Anthony and Ethan approached, the woman stood, her hands trembling slightly. Claire Donnelly was in her early 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile that mirrored the boy's own features. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid, and she wore a simple blouse and jeans. The moment she saw them, tears welled up in her eyes. "Anthony? Ethan?" she said, her voice cracking. "Yeah," Anthony replied, his throat tight. "It's us." Claire let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Then, without hesitation, she stepped forward and wrapped them both in a hug. It was the kind of embrace that spoke of years of longing and heartbreak, the kind that held all the words she couldn't say. "I've waited for this moment for so long," she whispered, her tears dampening their shoulders. "I'm so sorry I couldn't be there for you. I wanted to. I tried. But it's okay," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. "We're here now, piecing together the past. Over steaming cups of coffee and plates of pastries, Claire shared her story. She had been a young, single mother, abandoned by her boyfriend and pressured by her parents to give up her twins. When the agency separated the boys, it broke her heart, but she had no power to stop it. "I wanted you both to have a better life," she said, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you." Anthony and Ethan listened intently, their emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and understanding. For years, they had wondered about their past, and now, piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Claire pulled out an old photo album she had brought with her. Inside were pictures of them as babies, taken before the adoption. There were pictures of Anthony and Ethan lying side by side in a hospital bassinet, their tiny hands reaching for each other. There were letters, too, written to them over the years but never sent. "I didn't know where you were or if you'd ever find me," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I wrote these, hoping that someday you might read them." Anthony and Ethan took the letters with reverence, their hearts heavy with the weight of her words. This was their history, a history they had been denied but were now reclaiming. A new beginning. By the time the meeting ended, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the cafe. Claire hugged them both tightly, her voice filled with hope. "I know I can't make up for the years we lost," she said, "but I'd love to be a part of your lives, if you'll let me." Anthony and Ethan exchanged a look, their bond stronger than ever. "We like that," Anthony said, his voice steady. Ethan nodded, a small smile breaking through his tears. "Yeah, we'd like that a lot." As they drove home, Anthony and Ethan felt a sense of peace they hadn't known was possible. The journey to find the truth had been long and painful, but it had brought them closer, not just to each other, but to the families who had raised them, and the mother who had never stopped loving them. For the first time, their lives felt whole. And as they looked forward to the future, they knew they would face it together as brothers. The ripple effect. The weeks following the reunion with Claire Donnelly were a whirlwind of emotions for Anthony and Ethan. The revelation of their shared history, coupled with the raw, emotional bond they had begun to build with their biological mother, created a ripple effect that reached far beyond the two boys. It was as though the universe had realigned, forcing everyone in their orbit to adjust to a new normal. Confronting old wounds. Anthony sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the adoption papers spread out before him. His adoptive mother, Sarah, sat across from him, her face etched with concern. She had been quieter than usual since the boys' meeting with Claire, and Anthony could feel the tension lingering in the air. "Mom," Anthony began, his voice hesitant, "you've been distant lately. Are you okay?" Sarah let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging. "I'm just trying to process everything, sweetheart. It's not easy realizing there were things about your life that I didn't know." Anthony reached across the table and took her hand. "You're still my mom. That hasn't changed." Sarah smiled weakly. "I know, but it's hard not to feel like maybe I failed you. Maybe I should have asked more questions, pushed harder to find out about your past." Anthony shook his head. "You didn't fail me. You gave me a great life. You and Dad. You're everything I could have asked for. Meeting Claire doesn't change that." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed his hand tightly. "Thank you, Anthony. That means more than you know." Ethan's struggle. While Anthony found solace in his adoptive family's unwavering support, Ethan's journey was rockier. His adoptive father, Mark Carter, was struggling to accept the situation. A reserved and pragmatic man, Mark had always focused on providing for his family, but the revelation of Ethan's twin had shaken him deeply. One evening, Ethan found his father sitting alone in the living room, staring at an old family photo. The dim light from the lamp cast shadows across his face, making him look older than Ethan remembered. "Dad?" Ethan said softly, stepping into the room. Mark looked up, his expression unreadable. "Hey, son. Couldn't sleep. Ethan shook his head and sat down beside him. No, been thinking about everything. Mark sighed, his gaze returning to the photo. I'm happy for you, Ethan. I really am. Finding Anthony, meeting Claire, it's a miracle, but I can't help feeling like I've lost a part of you. Ethan frowned. You haven't lost me, Dad. You raised me. You're my father, no matter what. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. It's just hard to share, you know. Hard to think about the fact that there's another family out there who might want to claim you. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. No one's claiming me, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me. Mark chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Good, because I don't think I could handle losing you. The families come together. A month after their initial meeting, Claire invited both families to her home for a gathering. It was a chance for everyone to meet and, hopefully, bridge the gaps between their worlds. The Jacobs and the Carters arrived with nervous smiles, unsure of what to expect. Claire greeted them warmly, her home cozy and welcoming. Pictures of Anthony and Ethan, as babies, were now framed and proudly displayed on the mantel, alongside photos of Claire's life over the years. I'm so glad you could all come, Claire said, her voice genuine, as she led them into the living room. The atmosphere was tense at first. Sarah and Helen exchanged polite smiles, while Greg and Mark stuck to discussing mundane topics like sports and weather. But as the evening went on, the shared love for the boys began to break down the walls. Anthony and Ethan watched as their families found common ground. Sarah and Claire bonded over their mutual love of cooking, swapping recipes in the kitchen. Mark surprised everyone by joining Greg in a spirited debate about the best local fishing spots. By the end of the night, the room was filled with laughter and warmth. As the group gathered for a photo, Ethan whispered to Anthony, I think this might actually work. Anthony grinned. Yeah, it feels right. New beginnings. With their families now on better terms, Anthony and Ethan began to explore what it meant to be brothers. They spent countless hours together, discovering new shared interests and learning about each other's quirks. Anthony introduced Ethan to his favorite books, while Ethan taught Anthony how to improve his jump shot on the basketball court. One weekend, they decided to visit the hospital where they were born. The staff was kind enough to provide them with their birth records, including a copy of their original birth certificate. Seeing their names side by side, listed under Claire's name, brought a sense of closure they hadn't realized they needed. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we'd grown up together? Ethan asked as they sat on a bench outside the hospital. Every day, Anthony admitted. But I think maybe this is how it was supposed to happen. We found each other when we were ready. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. And now we've got the rest of our lives to catch up. The ripple effect. The discovery of their connection didn't just change Anthony and Ethan's lives. It impacted everyone around them. The Jacobs and the Carters grew closer, finding unexpected friendships in the process. Claire, once isolated by the guilt of her past, found a new sense of purpose in building relationships with her sons and their families. At school, Anthony and Ethan became inseparable. Their classmates, once fascinated by the novelty of their resemblance, now saw them as a dynamic duo, each complementing the other's strengths. Together, they started a mentorship program for younger students, inspired by their own journey of finding and supporting each other. As time went on, the boys began to feel like they had truly found their place in the world. They weren't just individuals anymore. They were part of a larger tapestry of love, resilience, and connection. The unbreakable bond. In the weeks following the family gathering, Anthony and Ethan's lives took on a new rhythm. The discovery of their shared history had not only filled a void they hadn't realized existed, but also deepened their understanding of themselves. Yet, as they worked to navigate their evolving relationship, they began to uncover the challenges and beauty of forging a bond that had been denied to them for so long. Exploring their roots. One crisp Saturday morning, Anthony and Ethan decided to visit the places from their mother Claire's past. She had offered to take them on a journey through her life, hoping to help them understand the choices she had been forced to make. The boys, eager to learn more, jumped at the opportunity. Their first stop was a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Claire pointed to a second-floor window, her voice thick with emotion. "That was my home when I found out I was pregnant. I was just a scared teenager, trying to figure out how to raise 2 babies on my own." Ethan glanced up at the window, imagining the young version of Claire pacing inside, overwhelmed by her circumstances. "You were so young," he said softly. Claire nodded. "Too young, according to my parents. They were the ones who pushed me to give you up. They thought it was the best option, but I never agreed." Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder. "We don't blame you, Mom. You did what you could." Claire smiled at the word Mom, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Their journey continued to a park where Claire had often gone to think during her pregnancy. As they walked along the winding paths, she shared stories about the hopes and dreams she had for them. Dreams she had never given up, even when the adoption agency took control. "I always believed you'd find each other," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words. "I just didn't know it would take so long." The struggles of adjustment. Back in their everyday lives, Anthony and Ethan began to grapple with the challenges of blending their worlds. Though their bond had grown quickly, it wasn't without its struggles. Small differences in their personalities occasionally led to tension, particularly when their competitive natures clashed. One afternoon during basketball practice, Ethan playfully nudged Anthony after scoring a point. "Come on, man, step it up. You're making this too easy." Anthony rolled his eyes but couldn't resist the urge to one-up his brother. He drove the ball past Ethan with a burst of speed, sinking a perfect layup. "Easy," says the guy who just got smoked. Their friendly banter quickly turned into a full-on competition, drawing the attention of their teammates. While most laughed at their antics, Coach Davis eventually intervened. "Jacobs, Carter," he barked, "if you two are done showing off, maybe the rest of us can get some practice in." The brothers exchanged sheepish grins, their rivalry momentarily forgotten. But later, as they walked home, Anthony broke the silence. "Do you think we're too similar?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Ethan shrugged. "Maybe. But that's not a bad thing. We just have to figure out how to balance it." Anthony nodded, realizing that their similarities were both a blessing and a challenge. They weren't just brothers. They were mirrors, reflecting both the best and the most frustrating parts of each other. A shared passion. One evening, as they sat in Anthony's room flipping through old photo albums, Ethan noticed a stack of books on the desk. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the top one. "Just some of my dad's old books," Anthony replied. "He's been letting me borrow them for a project I'm working on." Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes lighting up. "This is awesome. Have you ever thought about writing your own stories?" Anthony hesitated. "I don't know. I've always liked the idea, but I've never really tried." Ethan grinned. "Well, maybe you should. And if you do, I'll help." The idea sparked something in Anthony, and over the next few weeks, the brothers began working on a creative project together. They wrote stories based on their own experiences, blending their love of history and science fiction into a collection of short tales. It became their way of processing everything they had been through, turning their journey into something meaningful. The healing process. As their bond deepened, both boys began to notice changes in their families as well. The Jacobs and the Carters, once strangers, had grown into a tight-knit community, united by their shared love for the boys. Family dinners became a regular occurrence, filled with laughter and warmth. Claire, too, found healing in her relationship with her sons. She often joined them for their writing sessions, offering encouragement and sharing her own perspective. For her, the process was cathartic, a chance to finally be the mother she had always wanted to be. One evening, As they sat around the table brainstorming ideas, Claire paused and looked at them with a smile. "You know," she said, "I used to dream about moments like this. I didn't think they'd ever happen, but here we are." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "We're here now, and that's what matters." A new chapter. By the time the school year ended, Anthony and Ethan's lives had transformed in ways they never could have imagined. Their bond as brothers had grown unshakable, and their families had become a single, supportive unit. Together, they faced the future with a sense of hope and determination. On the last day of school, as they walked home together, Ethan turned to Anthony with a grin. "So, what's next for us?" Anthony thought for a moment, then smiled. "Anything we want. We've got the rest of our lives to figure it out." Ethan laughed. "Sounds like a plan, bro." As they walked into the setting sun, their shared journey was far from over. But for the first time, they knew they would face whatever came next, together. A family's journey. The summer following their first year as reunited brothers was unlike anything Anthony and Ethan had ever experienced. The two households, the Jacobs, the Carters, and now Claire, had become an extended family, navigating their new relationships while confronting lingering questions about their shared past. It was a summer of healing, self-discovery, and forging bonds that would last a lifetime. A summer road trip. One evening, Claire proposed an idea that caught everyone off guard. "What if we took a road trip?" she suggested over dinner at the Jacobs' house. "We could visit some of the places that are meaningful to our story. It might help us all connect more." The idea was met with a mix of excitement and nervousness. For Anthony and Ethan, it sounded like an adventure. For Sarah, Greg, Helen, and Mark, it was a chance to bridge the gaps between their families. A week later, 2 cars were packed with suitcases, snacks, and an air of cautious optimism. The group set off on a journey that would take them through small towns and big cities, tracing the boys' origins and creating new memories along the way. Their first stop was Portland, Oregon, where Claire had grown up. She showed them her childhood home, a modest brick house with a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Standing outside, Claire shared stories of her youth, painting a picture of the life she had lived before Anthony and Ethan were born. "I used to sit on that swing and dream about leaving this town," she said, her voice wistful. "But when I found out I was pregnant, everything changed. Suddenly, all I wanted was to create a home for you two." Anthony and Ethan listened intently, their admiration for Claire growing with every word. They realized that despite the pain and hardship she had endured, she had always held on to hope, finding answers. As the trip continued, the group made a detour to visit the now-defunct Sunrise Family Services building. Though the building was abandoned, the boys felt a strange sense of closure standing in the place where their lives had taken such a pivotal turn. "This is where it all started," Ethan said, his voice quiet as he stared at the crumbling facade. Anthony nodded, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "And look where we are now. We've come a long way." They took a photo together in front of the building, a symbolic gesture to mark how far they had come. For Claire, it was a bittersweet moment, a reminder of the pain of losing her sons, but also a testament to the resilience of their bond. Challenges on the road. Despite the overall excitement of the trip, tensions occasionally flared. Having so many people in close quarters for an extended period tested everyone's patience. Mark and Greg, in particular, struggled to see eye to eye on how to navigate the group's dynamic. During a stop at a roadside diner, the two men had a heated argument about the best route to their next destination. Voices rose, and the rest of the group watched awkwardly as the disagreement escalated. "Enough." Claire finally interjected, her voice firm but calm. "This trip isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about all of us finding a way to move forward, together." Her words struck a chord, and both men apologized. From that moment on, they worked harder to collaborate, setting aside their differences for the sake of the family. A new bond. One of the most memorable stops on the trip was a national park where Anthony and Ethan decided to go hiking together. It was the first time the brothers had spent an extended period alone since discovering their connection, and the experience deepened their bond. As they trekked through the forest, Ethan stopped to catch his breath, looking out over a scenic overlook. "Do you ever feel like maybe we were meant to find each other when we did?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. Anthony nodded, leaning on his hiking pole. "Yeah, if we'd found out earlier, we might not have been ready for it. Everything happens for a reason." Ethan grinned. "Who knew you were such a philosopher?" They both laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. In that moment, they felt an unspoken understanding, a shared determination to make the most of their second chance at being brothers. A heartfelt revelation. The final stop on their trip was a lakeside cabin Claire had rented for the group. On their last night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire gathered everyone around a fire pit. The crackling flames cast a warm glow over the group as she began to speak. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you all," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This trip has been about more than just revisiting the past. It's been about creating a future where we're all part of each other's lives." She paused, her eyes meeting each person's in turn. Ethan, I want you to know that I don't expect you to call me Mom or to replace the parents who raised you. But I hope you'll let me be part of your journey in whatever way feels right." Anthony felt a lump in his throat. "You're already part of our lives," he said, his voice steady. "You gave us life, and now you're giving us a chance to know you. That means everything." Ethan nodded, his expression sincere. "We're not losing anyone. We're just gaining more family." Claire's tears glistened in the firelight as she pulled them both into a hug. Around the fire, the Jacobs and the Carters exchanged smiles, the warmth of the moment spreading through the group. The journey home. When the trip ended, the group returned home feeling closer than ever. The journey had been more than just a physical one. It had been a journey of healing, understanding, and love. Anthony and Ethan resumed their daily routines, but the road trip had left a lasting impact. They felt more grounded, more connected, and more ready than ever to face the future. Their families, once fragmented, had become a united force, bound by a shared determination to support the boys in every way possible. As the summer came to a close, Anthony and Ethan reflected on the adventure that had brought them closer not just to each other, but to everyone they cared about. It was a new chapter in their lives, and they were ready to write it together, strengthening the bond. After their transformative summer road trip, Anthony and Ethan returned to their town with renewed spirits. Yet, the reality of daily life soon set in, bringing with it the challenges of maintaining their newfound connections. Their extended family now included Claire, and balancing these relationships would require effort from everyone. Adjusting to a bigger family. Saturday mornings at the Jacobs' house were typically quiet, with Sarah baking bread and Greg reading the paper. But now, Saturdays often involved Claire and the Carters, who had begun to feel more like family than visitors. The once cozy kitchen now bustled with overlapping conversations and the clatter of dishes. "I don't know how you manage all this," Claire said, watching Sarah knead dough. "It's impressive." Sarah smiled, her hands covered in flour. "Years of practice, but I'm glad we can share it with you now." Meanwhile, Greg and Mark bonded over a new shared project, building a treehouse for Anthony and Ethan in the backyard. Though the boys were teenagers, the project became a symbol of the unity forming between the families. "You know," Greg said as they hammered planks into place, "I wasn't sure how all this would turn out, but seeing the boys together, it's worth every bit of effort." Mark nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Agreed. They're not just brothers. They're a team. And it's our job to support that." Navigating new relationships. At school, Anthony and Ethan quickly became known as the inseparable twins. Teachers, friends, and classmates marveled at their connection, which seemed almost telepathic at times. They finished each other's sentences, shared private jokes, and even coordinated their outfits on occasion. But their newfound closeness wasn't without its challenges. Anthony, who had always been more introverted, sometimes struggled to keep up with Ethan's outgoing nature. Similarly, Ethan found it difficult to adjust to Anthony's need for quiet reflection. One afternoon, as they sat in the library working on a joint project, tensions boiled over. "Can you just stop fidgeting for 5 minutes?" Anthony snapped, his frustration getting the better of him. Ethan frowned, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not fidgeting. You're just too uptight." The argument escalated until the librarian shushed them, forcing both boys into an awkward silence. Later, as they walked home, Anthony broke the ice. "Sorry for snapping," he said, his voice soft. "I'm not used to sharing so much of my space." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I get it. I'm used to doing my own thing too. But I don't want this to mess things up between us." Anthony offered a small smile. "It won't. We'll figure it out." And they did, learning to respect each other's boundaries while still nurturing their bond. Claire's struggles. While Anthony and Ethan adjusted to their new dynamic, Claire faced her own challenges. Reconnecting with her sons had been a dream come true, but it also brought a wave of guilt for the years they had lost. She often found herself wondering if she had done enough to deserve their forgiveness. One evening, as she helped Ethan with a writing assignment, she hesitated before speaking. "Ethan, do you ever feel angry at me for giving you up?" Ethan looked up, surprised by the question. "No, I don't. I mean, I wish things had been different. But I know you didn't have a choice. You did what you thought was best." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I just want you to know how much I love you. Both of you. I've always loved you." Ethan reached over and took her hand. "We know, Mom. And we love you too." For Claire, those words were a balm for wounds that had festered for years. She realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could make the most of the present. A milestone celebration. As autumn approached, Sarah and Helen decided to organize a joint celebration for Anthony and Ethan's birthday. It would be their first birthday together since discovering they were brothers, and both families wanted to make it special. The party was held at a local park, with decorations, games, and a massive cake featuring their names. Friends, classmates, and family gathered to celebrate the occasion, and the boys were overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. During the cake-cutting ceremony, Ethan raised his voice to address the crowd. "I just want to say thank you to everyone who supported us this year. It's been a lot, but we're lucky to have so many people who care about us." Anthony nodded, adding, "And we're especially thankful to our parents, all of them, for making this day happen. We wouldn't be here without you." The crowd cheered, and Claire wiped away tears as she stood beside Sarah and Helen. In that moment, the families felt truly united, their bonds stronger than ever. Looking ahead, as the seasons changed, Anthony and Ethan began to focus on the future. Their shared love of writing led them to collaborate on a new project, a memoir detailing their journey of rediscovery. The process was both therapeutic and inspiring, allowing them to process their emotions while sharing their story with the world. One evening, as they worked on the final draft, Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know, if someone told me a year ago that I'd find a twin brother and write a book about it, I would have laughed." Anthony chuckled. "Same. But I'm glad we're doing this. It feels important." Ethan nodded. "It is. And no matter what happens, we'll always have this." Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they felt ready to face whatever came next, together, forging a future together. As the first anniversary of their reunion approached, Anthony and Ethan found themselves reflecting on how much their lives had changed in such a short time. They had gone from strangers to brothers, from two individuals searching for identity to a united force, navigating the complexities of family, friendships, and dreams. But the journey was far from over. The boys, now deeply bonded, were beginning to think about what the future might hold, not just for themselves, but for the families they had brought together. A big decision. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and bathed the Jacobs' backyard in shades of gold. Anthony and Ethan sat on the treehouse porch that Greg and Mark had built. The structure had become their sanctuary, a place where they could talk freely without the pressures of school or family dynamics. "You ever think about college?" Anthony asked, leaning back against the wooden railing. "All the time," Ethan replied, tossing a basketball between his hands. "But I'm still not sure where I want to go. What about you?" Anthony hesitated. "I've been thinking, what if we went to the same school? I mean, we've missed out on so much time as brothers. It'd be nice to stick together for a while longer." Ethan stopped tossing the ball and looked at Anthony. "You serious?" "Yeah," Anthony said, shrugging. "I know it's not what everyone does, but we're not like everyone else." Ethan grinned. "I like it. We could look for schools with good writing programs, maybe even somewhere close to home, so we can stay connected to the family." The idea took root that night, and over the following weeks, the brothers began researching colleges together. Their shared excitement became contagious, spreading to their parents, who were thrilled at the prospect of the boys supporting each other through the next chapter of their lives. Claire's opportunity. While the boys planned for college, Claire received an unexpected opportunity. One of her colleagues at the school where she worked mentioned an opening for a teaching position in their town, just a short drive from where the Jacobs and Carters lived. "I don't want to intrude," Claire said during a family dinner at the Carters' house, "but the idea of being closer to all of you, it's hard to ignore." Sarah reached across the table and took Claire's hand. "You wouldn't be intruding. You're part of this family now. And I think the boys would love having you nearby." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "Definitely. Plus, it means more of your lasagna." The room filled with laughter, but Claire's eyes glistened with emotion. The idea of being closer to her sons, and the families who had welcomed her so openly, felt like a second chance at the life she had always dreamed of. Within a month, Claire had packed up her modest apartment and moved into a cozy home just a few streets away from the Jacobs. Her presence brought a sense of completeness to the extended family, and her new job gave her a fresh start professionally, a test of resilience. Despite the growing harmony, life wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, Anthony came home from school looking unusually upset. He dropped his backpack by the door and slumped onto the couch. "What's wrong?" Greg asked, setting aside the book he was reading. "Some kids at school were making fun of me and Ethan," Anthony muttered, "calling us freaks for being so alike." Greg frowned. "I'm sorry, son. People can be cruel when they don't understand something." Anthony sighed. "I just don't get why it bothers them so much. We're not hurting anyone." Greg leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, when people see something they don't understand, it makes them uncomfortable. But that's not your problem to fix. What matters is how you and Ethan handle it." Later that evening, Anthony shared the incident with Ethan, who immediately suggested turning it into a story for their memoir. "We could write about what it's like to be twins who didn't grow up together," Ethan said. "How people react. The good and the bad. It might help others understand." Anthony nodded, a small smile breaking through his frustration. "Yeah, let's do it." The memoir takes shape. The memoir, which had started as a personal project, quickly became something much bigger. Anthony and Ethan poured their hearts into the manuscript, weaving together their individual experiences with their shared journey of rediscovery. They included anecdotes from their road trip, the emotional reunion with Claire, and even the challenges of blending their families. As the manuscript neared completion, Claire suggested reaching out to a local publisher who specialized in personal stories. The boys hesitated at first, unsure if anyone would be interested in their tale, but their parents encouraged them to take the leap. "You never know who might need to hear your story," Sarah said. "It could inspire someone going through their own struggles." With their family's support, Anthony and Ethan submitted the manuscript. To their surprise, the publisher responded enthusiastically, calling their story a testament to the power of resilience and family. a book launched to remember. The book, titled Finding Each Other, A Twin Journey of Hope and Family, was released the following spring. The launch event was held at the Jacobs bookstore, where friends, family, and community members gathered to celebrate the boy's achievement. Ethan stood at the front of the room, holding a copy of the book in his hands. "This story is about more than just us," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about the people who supported us, who loved us, and who helped us find each other. We couldn't have done it without you." Anthony stepped up beside him, his voice steady but emotional. "We wrote this book to share our journey, but also to remind people that it's never too late to find what you've lost, or to build something new." The crowd erupted into applause, and Claire wiped away tears as she watched her sons stand side by side, united in a way she had once only dreamed of. Looking ahead, as their senior year came to a close, Anthony and Ethan finalized their college plans, deciding on a school with a strong writing program that was only a short drive from home. Their families couldn't have been prouder, and the boys felt ready to take on whatever the future held. On their last night before leaving for college, the family gathered for a farewell dinner. Around the table, laughter and love filled the air, and the boys realized just how far they had come. "We've got a lot to look forward to," Ethan said as they clinked glasses for a toast. Anthony nodded, his heart full. "And we'll face it together." As the night wore on, the boys looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had become their foundation. Their journey had been unexpected, challenging, and often painful, but it had brought them to a place of love and understanding they never could have imagined. For Anthony and Ethan, the future wasn't just bright. It was limitless.